When I say that we are in a period of transition, people have no idea how profound this will be. I know this sounds prophetic, exaggerated, like I'm dramatizing, but I'm not. I base myself on data and evidence. These won't be abrupt changes from one day to the next, although they will be fast. And what would take decades will happen in years. What would happen in years will take months. It's something accelerated and fast, but not sudden. But in general, what I want you to understand is that the world where you grew up is disintegrating and something new will come. Some people will say that this is normal because the world has always changed, but what they don't understand is that the changes we're starting to see are deeper in several areas and faster than changes that happened in other periods of human history. The closest thing to such a drastic period like this would be the period from 1905 to 1945. 1905 to 1945. Because in those 40 years, we saw for the first time an Asian power, the Empire of Japan, defeating a European power, the Empire of Russia, the Empire. We saw the First World War and the first practical use of weapons of mass destruction, which were chemical weapons. Mobilizing millions of soldiers at once was an unprecedented scale. Then we saw the first truly global pandemic, which was the Spanish flu. We witnessed the largest global economic crisis at that time, the 1929 crisis. And then World War I, which made the mobilizations of World War I seem small. The destruction of two continents. We see the collapse of the once all-powerful European empires, which no one would have imagined possible 40 years earlier. And the introduction of nuclear weapons, the first weapons truly capable of devastating life on the planet. All of this in 40 years, so it was a period of profound, rapid changes that transformed the world. It wasn't the end of the world, because at the end of this transition, what we saw was an explosion of material and immaterial growth that humanity had never seen before. But now we are in a period that will also be one of transition. In fact, everything suggests that it will be even more radical than that period from 1905 to 1945 that I mentioned. Because basically, a series of parallel crises will reach the limit of how long they can be postponed and will end up erupting and exploding together. They will cause new crises, most of which we can barely predict. What consequences they will trigger is, for the most part, still unknown. So, understand that you and I were built, educated, and prepared to live in a world that is ending. So this transition won't be easy. It will be quite distressing and painful, obviously more for some than for others, but it will be a transition eventually. But here what we need to focus on is what is predicted and has a huge probability of happening, because this transition will be traumatic for society. Most researchers today agree that the world order is unstable because the foundations on which it was built no longer work, and the results of this instability are now becoming more and more visible. But most people don't understand why this is happening. Look, I'm not saying this because I have a hunch that something might be happening. In fact, many people who have what I call a cockroach antenna even know that something is happening, but they can't exactly explain why or what it is. But there are no grounds to explain why this is happening. Because, you see these historical collapses and periods of transition every few centuries, and they're always driven by a combination of factors. It's not just one thing that causes it, it's several. It's like a glass of water, where the last drop falls in and the water spills out. The press and opportunists always focus on that last drop and keep debating it, as if by preventing that last drop from falling, this catastrophe could have been avoided, but they ignore that the glass was already full. I prefer to focus on the glass, on the water that was there before that last drop, because that's what explains and helps us predict the path we're heading down. And that glass of water is basically divided into three aspects, which when combined show us a path. If we will have these social civilizational collapses, which is when we have the combination of energy production and bioenergy production. Don't think only about gas and oil, but about energy in the broad sense of the word, which includes food. So, when I talk about energy, understand it in the literal sense of electricity, gas, oil, but also energy, let's say vital energy, which is what we need for our bodies, which is food. So the combination of energy factors, demographic factors, and economic factors has defined the fate of civilizations, almost always having to do with inequality in access to these factors and with competition for labor, which eventually results in social collapses. If we use structural demographic theory, which is a theory developed to, let's say, understand the less obvious causes of major social implosions, such as revolutions and civil wars, this theory is based on the principle that these types of events are frequent, and the result of a combination of structural pressures and events that will trigger other events. Thus, according to the theory, complex human societies can be represented as systems that have three main compartments: the general population, the elites, and the state. These three groups, in turn, not only interact with each other, but also interact with instability. The theory focuses on structures that will affect these three groups, and there is no shortage of studies demonstrating the correlation of these factors. David Fisher, in the book The Great Wave, examines the long-term historical pattern of revolutions, correlating this with prices. In other words, periods of significant and persistent increases in goods and services that have occurred in different parts of the world throughout history. Fisher argues that these price revolutions are the result of fundamental changes in the world economies and have a series of social, political, and cultural consequences. And if we look at the charts showing this in Western Europe, this correlation becomes clear. He establishes a firm pattern of four waves. The first one is in prices during the medieval period, which will result in the Renaissance. The second in the prices of the 16th century, which results in the subsequent rise of the Enlightenment. The third wave with the prices of the 18th century, which will bring the Victorian era, and the fourth wave of prices in the 20th century, which, when he wrote, was still ongoing since he wrote this in 1996. But today we have data, and if we look at this series of tables I made with commodity prices between September 1992 and September 2022, it reinforces what he said and was based on. Because when we look at food prices, it's clear there's been an absurd increase in their prices, especially in proteins like soy, beef, and chicken, although it's also clear in wheat and corn. And if we also base ourselves on fertilizer prices, after all, fertilizers affect food prices for obvious reasons. We see that there is also a price surge that will only compare to the peaks we had between 2007 and 2008. Which reflected the surge in fossil fuel prices such as oil and natural gas, which are used as raw materials for the production of most fertilizers. In addition, there was a strong demand for fertilizers due to increased agricultural production in developing countries such as China and India. What else caused the increase in 2007 and 2008? And what raises a worrying sign for me, which also reinforces this, is that on the other hand, during this 30-year period, we saw very little growth, or a return to the initial level, or almost stability. These were other commodities such as rubber, hardwoods, nickel, or iron, which are the basis of the industrial process. And by the way, if my estimates seem bad, those of other geopolitical analysts are even worse. Because for Peter Zirin, for example, we will probably see the biggest hunger crisis in history in the next 10 years. But my analysis can still be reinforced by Peter Turgeon's research. Using computational models, he found patterns that preceded the French Revolution or the fall of the Roman Republic. And using this model, in 2010, he predicted that the United States and most of the world would begin to face a civilizational and social collapse in 2020. Basically, he predicted that the 2010s would be a period of increasing instability in the United States and Western Europe, which would then result in the beginning of this collapse. Starting from 2020, he uses quantitative historical analysis, which reveals that complex human societies are affected by recurring and predictable waves of political instability in the United States, although in many other countries as well. Real wages have been stagnant or even declining for decades, and by real understand the purchasing power of those wages, a growing gap between the rich and the poor. an overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees who, in turn, are unable to enter the job market, and an explosive public debt on the part of governments. These social indicators apparently have no connection, but in fact, they are completely related to each other. All of them experienced decisive moments during the 1970s. Historically, such developments have served as indicators of impending political instability. So Turchin's research reveals that we have these secular cycles, which are very long processes that interact with short-term processes. In the United States, there were peaks of instability of about 50 years approximately that occurred around 1870, 1920, and 1970. So based on these metrics, he predicted in 2010 that another one would occur starting in 2020. He didn't know exactly what would happen, but that the beginning of this process would start in 2020. He uses the so-called Kondratiev wave, even though most economists don't like him. It matches certain historical patterns that are interesting and, in his case, ended up being prophetic. Since 2020, we entered the start of this crisis. And I can't say how long it will take to pass, but it is a milestone in this transition. I don't believe it will be less than 10 years, and I say this in an optimistic sense because it will probably be more. Another researcher in structural demographic theory who also ended up being prophetic was Joshua Goldstein back in 1988. He believed that some renewed global economic growth could start to occur from 1995 to 2020. According to these metrics, there would be a period of increasing wars around 2000 to 2030 and an inflationary phase from 2010 to 2035. We have to give him credit since those were bold predictions, considering he was trying to predict 40 years into the future. But it's impressive how the metrics he used actually followed the historical pattern. His projections indicated that, after 1980, the dotted lines show an increasingly larger area of plausible futures, depending on the ongoing rate of hegemonic decline in relation to the long wave period, while the upper dotted line indicates a rapid and continuous decline in United States hegemony, so that hegemonic war could be conceivable right at the beginning of the next phase of ascent, which might have started in the 2010s. So, the danger of a hegemonic war could be postponed until the next ascent, in the second half of the 21st century. But an intermediate path between these possibilities would not take us far from the precedent of 1893 to 1914, when the danger of a hegemonic war would be very high, especially at the end of the next outbreak of war around 2020. And he predicts, in 1920, that the future conflict for global hegemonic rivalry will be between the United States and China. Since for him China would fit the profile of a possible successor to hegemony, because it would have a rapid industrialization in a new technological style which could eventually make China economically successful. And of course he adds the population and geographic factors. And also China's diplomatic or geopolitical capacity, which knew how to separate ideology from realism. And for that to happen, for him, it would be enough for China not to get involved in a possible conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So is this hegemonic dispute between the United States and China close to reaching its breaking point in the 2020s? Which is quite impressive because in 1988 it was still argued that possibly a war would be with the Soviet Union, or else others pointed to the rise of Japan. But practically no one talked about China as a future power capable of rivaling or surpassing the United States. But then we have this situation where a series of crises are happening at the same time. And I've said it here several times before that no crisis disturbs me as much as the demographic crisis, because it's the hardest one to solve and it's the one that will generate the most derivative crises. Most of them we can't even predict yet, because often someone thinks that to solve the demographic crisis, just one or another measure would be enough. But what they don't understand is that it's the result of the sum of several factors. It's not just the cost of living, it's not just the anti-natality culture, it's not just urbanization, it's not just the high level of education that the population has started to achieve. If it were only one of them, it would be easy to solve. But the problem is that all of this, combined with much more, is what triggered this crisis and makes it even harder to solve. And, as I said, it will lead to a series of other related crises. Because this demographic crisis is not just about low birth rates, but also about high longevity. If it were in another time, in a hypothetical case, where people had few children but still had a low aging rate, if we lived only 40 or 50 years, this wouldn't be a serious problem. But we're talking about people living more than 70 years, possibly much more than 80 years, along with this low birth rate. This demographic crisis, which I've discussed in other videos, could impact Brazil even sooner, because it was expected that Brazil would reach its plateau or population stagnation at some point between 2040 and 2045. But the latest Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística survey couldn't have brought worse results. In 2017 we had 207 million people, and now, in 2022, it was expected that we would reach the mark of 215 million. But we didn't continue with 207 million people, almost 208 million, increasing by about 700,000 inhabitants. In other words, we brought forward population stagnation by 20 or 25 years, which is quite bad. Because in another video I made here on the channel where I talk about why I don't bet on Brazil, I talked about how in the next 4 years we would be in the last 5 minutes of the second half, but now it's clear that we're actually already heading into the penalty shootout. Crisis we can expect includes labor loss, raising prices for nearly everything, from industrial goods to commodities, even more so for industrial goods. Because we will work less, but we will still have the same basic needs, especially for food. We can expect food crises in regions that depend on food imports to survive. So, countries in the Middle East and most of Africa will face increasing hunger, because we will produce less food. Not only because of demographic factors, but also because of the war in Ukraine. Because this war means that 2 of the 4 largest food exporters in the world are out of the global food supply chain. Not to mention that, in the case of Russia, they were the main global supplier of fertilizers, so this brought enormous, gigantic instability to global food production. Of course, Russia is still selling to other countries, but Ukraine is already out of the equation, and in Russia's case it won't sell to certain countries, like Europe. Because the United States, despite the sanctions, kept its import trade of Russian fertilizers, while the Europeans stayed out of it. We can expect urban emptying crises, with large buildings in major cities becoming increasingly empty due to a lack of residents. We can expect more people depending on Social Security and the government to survive, which, as a consequence, will give more power to rulers and make them increasingly authoritarian. We can expect huge cultural clashes because of uncontrolled immigration, with Europe being the main example of this today. Because while they are worrying about containing a Russia, because we already know that in real life it wouldn't have the strength to take over many European countries, even if it wanted to, and there are no indications that it really wants to. They ignore the real problem, which is racial hatred and Islamic extremism growing within their own countries. They are ignoring a problem that will, in fact, bring them to the brink, or maybe even to collapse, to worry about Russia, which is a problem that is more than sufficiently contained. Anyway, there are several foreseeable crises and a number of others that we can't even imagine yet. And that brings us to another point, which is the myth that technology enthusiasts sell, the myth that technology will save us, that we will be able to solve all these demographic problems with robots and artificial intelligence, as if we lived in the world of the Jetsons. And that's an exaggeration that worries me, because instead of looking for real solutions to this crisis, which, it must be made clear, will be the greatest crisis humanity has faced since the Industrial Revolution, world leaders keep stalling and believing in technological miracles to save us. We are literally betting on a solution that has never been tested before to deal with a problem we've never faced before. You don't have to be a great mathematician to know that the odds are very bad. Besides that, two more problems come to mind with this enthusiasm for technology. The first is that, contrary to popular belief, we're not developing technologically as fast as people think. In fact, there are strong indications that we might actually be slowing down. People see new apps or artificial intelligences like Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer or Midjourney and they're amazed. But the problem is that the vast majority of these technologies aren't new, they're just becoming more popular. Actually, we're confusing access and popularization with innovation, and there's strong evidence pointing in that direction. The first sign is that technological innovation tends to strongly correlate with economic growth. That's why when we look at real gross domestic product growth in advanced and global economies, it's so concerning. Because since the 1970s, gross domestic product growth and global economic output have rapidly declined year after year with signs of slowdown. Since 1970, our patent activity seems to have focused mainly on incremental improvements to existing technologies. The blue line represents a focus on iterative improvements and steady gains. The other lines represent our ability to invent new ideas and discover new domains of science and technology. If we use the data to visualize the results, it becomes clear that the number of technologically new originations and combinations decreased for a while and even had a more severe drop recently. Another reason is that apparently we actually do produce a lot of science because, look, in 2004 we were producing on average 1 page of scientific article in the world per second. It's an extremely high number, and obviously since then it has increased a lot, much more. In fact, it has increased almost in an industrial and predatory way. Not rarely, elite universities around the world consider the quantity of papers produced when hiring and maintaining the positions of professors and researchers. It's a daunting demand for those who are at the beginning of their scientific careers, and the result is that the more production there is, the lower the quality. Basically, what's important is to publish, and in most cases, in the vast majority of times, the articles tend to be repetitive. And this becomes clear when we look at the research by Professors Russell Funk, Michael Park, and Professor Ellen Lee Hay. They observe that, despite the unprecedented expansion of immaterial and technological production we've seen in recent centuries, the rate of innovation in science is decreasing. Documents, patents, and applications. They have become less innovative compared to previous works and less likely to connect different areas of knowledge, which is something vital for innovation. The gap between the year of the discovery and the awarding of a Nobel Prize has also increased, suggesting that today's contributions do not compare to those of the past. Exactly because this slowdown is happening and its true extent is not clear. This led the research team to analyze data from 45 million articles and 3,900,000 patent applications between 1945 and 2010s. They rely on fundamental theories of scientific and technological change to characterize what innovation is. These theories propose two different types of advances. Those that improve existing scientific knowledge and therefore consolidate, so to speak, the scientific status quo, and those that disrupt existing knowledge, driving subsequent research in new directions. And to quantify this, they created the so-called CD index, tracking how this CD index has changed over time. The researchers concluded that papers and patents are now less likely to cause disruptions and more likely to consolidate, a rate that has been declining since 1980. Another key indicator is data storage prices, which have dropped over the past 50 years, especially from 2000 to 2010. But now it's also heading towards stagnation. Even though we're dealing with more and more data, the cost hasn't been dropping like it used to, which could also be an indication of this problem. But there's one last aspect I want to mention to show that we're really heading toward possible technological stagnation. And why can't we count on it to save us, which is Moore's Law? which basically means that the number of transistors on chips doubles for the same cost every 2 years. And today we're very close to the physical limit. For that to happen, it will probably be in 2025 as well, with transistors reaching 2 nanometers. And why does that matter? Well, that's good. From then on, the costs will keep getting higher and higher, with increasingly higher expenses. More obstacles for research because they generate costs. And adding up all the context I mentioned, this scenario becomes quite clear. I know that some experts will talk about quantum computing, but only a few countries will have that. And even they will face a shortage of technicians for this kind of technology because it's already scarce today. It's also important to remember that most countries, especially US here in Brazil, don't have the level of robotization and industrialization of South Korea, Japan, or Germany. So most countries faced a demographic crisis without having the resources that these ultra-developed countries have. And as I said before, we have no guarantee that betting on artificial intelligence and robots would be the solution. That's speculative. And given how we're probably entering a likely phase of technological stagnation, not even that bet will probably be tested. This recent collapse of several tech companies is also a reflection of that. It's the tech market regrouping and resettling because there were a lot of abuses. A colossal amount of money was invested in processes and methods that didn't generate the expected or promised innovation, or didn't move forward, or moved very little. And adding this collapse in tech companies at the same time as a big increase in food and energy commodities, it becomes clear that the scenario is disturbing. So, we have two very big problems here, the demographic crisis and a possible technological crisis. Because here comes the point that I want you to really understand. Well, it doesn't matter if your favorite political economic model is capitalism, socialism, fascism, or any other. All the economic political models we've developed are based on the assumption that the market will keep growing year after year. There will be more demand than production. We have never, in the post-industrial revolution period, dealt with a crisis that involves population decline and a lack of technological innovation. If we look at the timeline, these two metrics have always grown, and for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, they are starting to slow down and possibly stagnate. This isn't the end of the world, it's just a transition to something unknown, as I said. But these crises, demographic, technological, food, energy, along with more wars, more popular uprisings, and more authoritarianism from public authorities, will be part of everyday life in the coming decades. And there are no exceptions because the world we were born and raised in is gone. The rules will be different now. This isn't catastrophism or exaggeration, the data is there, it's conclusive. There's nothing to argue or discuss in that sense. The question is what to do to minimize the damage. And I'm not optimistic about that because all you have to do is look at our elites. And I'm not just talking about the elites in Brazil, but in most of the world, especially in the West. When we look at the political, scientific, artistic, or business leaders, it's clear how these elites are united, disconnected from average citizens. They literally live in another world and ignore reality in a pathological way, imposing agendas and desires that are completely foreign to the popular will. And they increase hostilities among the population more and more. An example of this is that even though we are facing one of the biggest food crises in history, at the same time we have artists and politicians advocating against agribusiness here in Brazil. It's completely absurd and ridiculous. So, by the end of the century, we can expect the birth of new countries and the death of others. Likely new ideologies. If not a major global war, then most likely a series of small wars and terrorist and criminal uprisings. It won't be an easy transition process, but as I said, it's a transition process. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. And a super, hyper, mega special thanks to the channel members who have helped me keep bringing genuine geopolitics content to you. Hugs and see you next time.